What's up guys, it's Amanda and welcome back to my art channel. Today we're going to be doing an art supply review and I'm going to be reviewing the Concept dual tip markers. Now I've had these for a little while, but I've just been really behind on getting a review out for you guys, so for that I do apologize. But these are some alcohol-based markers, which means we have a potential alternative to Copic markers. So I'm going to be going into that today. I'm going to be comparing and contrasting a lot of different points for you today of these markers versus Copic markers. So first I'm just going to go over some of the points about these markers specifically. Then I'm going to get into the swatches and the demonstrations of how these markers compare to Copics. I'm going to do a little coloring demo, and then I'm going to come back at the end and kind of give you my final thoughts of how these markers compare to Copics. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned till the end of the video. But let's take a look at this baby right here. So this is a 24 set of basic colors. Comes in this nice little carrying case, which has a little handle, makes it very nice for travel and really easy to store them. So this is a look at all of your colors. Like I said, you get 24 colors in here. One thing to note is that there are no grays. You get a blender, you get a black, and then you get 22 other pretty vivid colors. And if you wanted to purchase this exact set, you can purchase them on Jerry's Artorama for $39.99. I'm not sponsored by them. That is just where I purchased mine. And you can also purchase them in bundles where you get paper and the markers. I purchased mine with some crescent render paper, which is actually what I'm going to be swatching them on today. So you'll get a little look at how I feel about that paper as well. But that is where I purchased mine, so I will have that linked down for you below. That way if you wanted to check them out and purchase them for yourself. But let's take a look at the actual marker itself. So on the box it claims that it has a dual tip marker with one brush tip and one chisel tip, and I'll get into that in a second. It says the ink is very vibrant, professional, and high quality, ergonomic, anti-roll barrel. So you can see, let's see if I can kind of show you here. So you can see the barrel is kind of squared off, very similar to a Copic original marker. The caps are kind of tapered, and you can see which cap has which nib by looking here in the middle. You can see there's a chisel tip indicator right here and then a brush tip indicator right here. Here's what's interesting about the brush tip factor. It's that when you look online at Jerry's Artorama's website, it actually calls it a fine tip. So when you look at it, you're getting something that's more similar to what you would get with a Copic original, where it is that bullet nib, or something that's like the original Prisma markers or the original Winsor & Newton markers. It's not a brush tip. So that is one thing that definitely does not stand up to Copic markers. This is a brush tip. This gives you a lot of line variation, a lot of flexibility, and it still allows you to cover both fine and large areas very easily. But it is kind of weird how they advertise this brush nib, because sometimes they call it a brush nib and sometimes they call it a fine nib. Also, one thing I want to mention is closing these markers is kind of interesting, because you can see, I don't know, maybe it's going to be kind of hard to tell. The markers kind of have a short side and a long side on the cap, so they kind of like curve up and down. I often find myself having difficulty closing them. They're also just kind of like stiff and hard to close. They do feel very sturdy. The grip is nice and they don't roll off your desk, which is a plus. One thing that is kind of evident about these markers though is that they smell. They smell so strong, and I get a headache every single time I use them. Even just opening this one now, I'm like starting to get a headache. So if you are sensitive to that kind of thing, something to be aware of. So I just wanted to mention that quickly. But these are super affordable. You can buy the markers individually for about $1.99 a piece, again off of Jerry Artorama's website. Some other things to note is that they do come in 72 different colors, which is a pretty good variety, not as good as some other brands, but still fairly decent. And then they also do mention on the website in the product description that these are good for blending. So I'm going to kind of go into the demo part of this video now and show you guys how these markers swatch and how they compare to Copics. Okay, so as you can see, I have swatched out all 24 colors here, including the colorless blender, which I'm not sure why, but overall, this is the color range that you get with this set. And I kind of want to break down just a couple of key factors that I think are notable or worth mentioning here. And that is that you get a decent amount of kind of pinks and purples, you get a decent amount of yellows, a decent amount of greens and blue-greens, and a decent amount of blues. Which I think is good, and it's definitely good to have multiple of each color in order to make your blending experience a lot easier. But I do want to mention that there are no grays in this set, and I'm not saying that there should be, but I'm just saying that grays are kind of one of those essentials that are good to have, especially when you're starting out. I also think that this set is lacking a lot of earth tones. As you can see here, there's only 3 sort of brown colors here, and this one is virtually black. So you don't get a lot of depth with those, which I think are really important, and they're really good to have a lot of these colors, earth tones and grays, when you're starting out. So it's great that you get all of these colors. I just wish there was a few more neutral colors in here as well. Another thing I wanted to mention is the coating system with the concept markers. As far as I know, there appears to be none, at least not one that makes a lot of sense. Now, you know, with Copic markers, you have the letter that indicates the color family, or sometimes letters, depending. And then you have a saturation number, and then you have a brightness or lightness to darkness number. So it's really easy to tell just by looking at the cap what the color is going to be like in comparison with other colors. For example, I have down here a Copic marker B23 phthalo blue marker and B24 sky marker. These colors are very, very close and very similar, which makes them very ideal for blending. And then you look at the concept markers and you have P84 and P85, colors that you think might be similar by looking at the caps. But you can see when you try and blend them that they're actually pretty different. And another thing to note here is that they don't really blend as smoothly. I didn't try very hard to blend these Copic markers, but trust me, if I did, this would be a seamless gradient. And this one I actually did try, and it sort of ended up just looking muddy. And when you put the lighter color on top of the darker color to attempt to get it to blend, it sort of just makes it look messy. So that's another thing to note, and that happens several times throughout this color range. You can see that PB183 is actually darker than PB185, which by looking at the cap you might not think that, and so you might think that this is the lighter one and then try and shade with this, only to realize that this is actually lighter. So that can be a bit troublesome and a little bit confusing. Also, there are a couple colors in here that are so similar, I wish they would have swapped it out for another one. For example, Y38 pale yellow and Y164 anise are so similar. I wish they would have given us another color, perhaps another brown, to sort of accent the gap that is clearly going on here with BR97 and BR98. BR97 and BR98 are so drastically different that there's no way that you could blend these, which might cause a lot of issues if you're looking to blend anything that's brown, like hair or skin or trees or rocks or mountains or any of the multiple things that are the color brown in your artwork. So this is really one downside for me. And another group of colors that are very similar are deep red and geranium. I really didn't need both of these. I would have much rather preferred a deeper brown or kind of a more mid-tone brown or a deeper red. Same thing with PB76 and PB183. These are slightly different. You can definitely see a difference, but they're not really different enough for me to justify having both of these in the same set. So that is one complaint that I have about this set, is that there does seem to be kind of a lot of color dupes, and 24 colors isn't a lot, so any colors that you have that are similar are really wasted. Now, I did kind of want to compare a couple of colors to the actual Copic markers just to see if this company was trying to be shady and directly dupe a couple of Copic markers. That doesn't seem to be the case, but there was an instance where I saw YR24 and I thought, hey, that's a Copic marker color as well. So I wanted to see what they looked like side by side. As you can see, here is YR24 from the Copic marker range. It is quite a bit darker than the concept marker, and it's a little bit more brown, kind of, and this is a little bit more kind of like orangey golden. So they weren't exactly the same, but I just thought that would be interesting to compare them. And then this one, which didn't have the same numbers, but they shared the same name, pale yellow, were almost identical. Y11 and Y38 from Copic to Concept were very identical, very, very similar. And so that was kind of surprising. So I was kind of interested to see if that was a common scenario, and found that it really wasn't. And I have an example of two that are very different here. And that's Light Pink by Copic, which is RV21, and Light Pink by Concept, which is RP138. You can see that the one from Concept is a little bit more purple, and it's almost more fluorescent than the light pink from Copic marker. And one thing to also note is that the caps on these markers can be very, very deceiving. I want to mention that by showing you these two, which are RP138 and RP9. These are, you can see on the caps, almost identical, but in these swatches, very, very different. And having an accurate cap indicator can be very important. I would always recommend swatching out all of your colors anyway, just so you have a really good idea of what you're working with. But when the caps are deceiving like that, you can run into problems like picking up the wrong marker by accident, and these are very tiny letters, so if you don't read them right away, that can be an issue as well. So that was one downside for me that I found. So I talked about how they kind of blend together. I feel that the Copic markers blend much easier and much more effortlessly than the Concept markers, and the color range and the coating system makes it really, really easy and foolproof to find colors that would blend together. That is not the case for the Concept markers. Another interesting comparison that I wanted to do was the kind of layering ability of the two markers. So here I have BR107 Sand, and I compared that with E31 Sand from Copic, and you can see they are quite a bit different. This is a little bit more orangey, this is a little bit more golden, but there's another color comparison for you. But I wanted to test how well these colors layer. So how well the color builds on itself, and how it's really able to give you more bang for its buck, really, so that you can get multiple colors out of the same marker, so you can even shade with the same marker, that kind of thing. And I know that's something that a lot of people do with Copic markers, especially when they're starting out, because it's very cost effective. You can get multiple uses out of one marker by simply building up the color to be significantly darker, or by layering it on lightly to get a color that's lighter. So that's what I did here, and I do think that it's much easier and more effective to layer the Copic markers compared to the Concept markers. What I found was that after about 3 layers, they didn't really get significantly darker, and they sort of had this, I don't know, weird thing where it bled weird. Blending these Concept markers sort of doesn't work quite like how you would expect. The color bleeds out a lot, and as you can see, like down here, it kind of just doesn't end up looking smooth. So I think the Copic markers in general are much smoother, but they also build a little bit better. You can see this is what 5 layers of the Concept marker looks like, and it does get darker. That is an effective gradient, but you don't get to push it quite as dark as you would with the Copic markers, which you can see I got 6 fairly distinct color variations there, which I think is really nice. The final test that I wanted to do was the smudge test with different sort of inking and line art tools that I commonly use in my own work, and those were the Prismacolor Kohl Erase pencils, and in that instance, both of them sort of smudged the pencil, not enough for it to sort of tamper with the color of the ink, but it is notable that it did, both smudged the Kohl Erase pencil about evenly. They actually, across the board, they performed about evenly, and that just goes to show that alcohol-based markers just smudges some materials more than others, and it's important to know which tools are meant to be, you know, worked with in conjunction with alcohol-based markers and which ones aren't. For example, mechanical pencil smudges quite a bit, and it does alter the color of the Copic marker a little bit as well. Staedtler Tri-Plus fine liners, same thing. They bleed a lot when the marker is layered on top of them, but if you actually color first and then wait for all of the ink to dry and then do your line art after you've colored, these work great. I just don't recommend using them underneath the markers, because you will get a significant amount of bleeding. The Sakura Pigma Microns stood up great in both cases. There was no smudging, and it was beautiful. It was no smudges, and they both performed beautifully. Same goes for the Pentel Pocket Brush Pen. It held up very well and was very Copic proof. Now that you've seen me go over all of the colors in this set and kind of compare and contrast them with Copic markers in a few different instances, let's get into the coloring demo where I color a sketch that I did on the back of this paper, and that'll kind of give you a demonstration of what it was like working with these markers. Alright, so now as you can see, I am working on the Crescent Render paper, which is a no show through paper. So on the back of this same sheet of paper is all of the swatches that I did. So I got to kind of flip back and forth and see all of the color swatches that I did, which I did find helpful while I was coloring this. And I approached this illustration much like I would any other illustration if I was coloring it with Copic markers. And I started with the skin, and I started with the lightest color that I had, which was BR107, and I kind of tried to layer that up a couple of times to get it darker in some areas and give some dimension. And I also put down a layer of the colorless blender at first to make sure that the ink would kind of spread out very smoothly, especially because I had to color some of these spaces with the bullet nib, which can tend to get a little streaky. So I put down the colorless blender first to make sure that it would go down fairly smooth. I did have a little bit of trouble coloring the skin. Some of that was just I was coloring with fewer colors than I was used to, and some of that was, layering the colors got to be a little bit muddy. Coloring the shirt, I had no problems because, like I said, this set offers a pretty good range of yellows. Same thing with the blue. I didn't feel like I had any issues coloring her jeans. And I was able to layer up the color enough to get a decent amount of dimension, not as much as I would get in my normal illustrations, and that is something to note that, I sort of knew I wasn't going to get the exact same results as I would with my Copic markers in this piece, and part of that's just learning curve, and part of that's just because the colors don't blend the same way that they do with Copics, and not having that brush nib really meant that I was limited in some capacity. I'm sure there are people that are more familiar with working with these kinds of markers, and they could do a little bit more with them, but this is what I'm working with, and I'm obviously limited by my own experience in some ways, so that is something to note. And now I'm just quickly doing the line art, and I decided to do the line art after, which is something I've been doing more in my artwork anyway, so that's not really unusual. Sorry, my big fat head is in the way. But overall, I'm happy with this illustration. I think I was able to work with these markers fairly effectively. I think my least favorite part of it is the hair, just because it's not quite as smooth and there's not quite as much dimension and detail as I'm used to. But overall, I'm happy with the result, and I think that these markers are really decent to start out with, especially if you're not familiar with using alcohol-based markers. Alright, now I know you might feel like I've already bombarded you with a lot of information regarding these markers, but I wanted to just come together at the end of this video and give you my final thoughts and some very clear-cut comparisons between the concept markers and the Copic markers. Now, just a quick note, obviously I am far more familiar with Copic markers, so it's really no question that I would prefer them. I've been working with them for years. Obviously I like them or something, but I do think that there are some definite pros to the concept marker, and so I wanted to go through these specific categories and really compare and contrast the two, and why in some instances you might prefer this one over this one. So let's get into that now. The first and probably biggest factor for most of you is price. Now, if you're a beginner, Copic markers are incredibly daunting because they're a huge investment, and I totally get it because I was there once too. Copic markers are top of the line, amazing quality, but I don't recommend them to beginners simply because if you end up buying them and not liking them, then you wasted a huge amount of money. So if that's you and you're thinking that you want to start getting into markers but you're not sure how, I would highly recommend the concept markers because, like I said, they're very budget friendly. You can get a set of 24 for about 40 bucks, whereas if you were to purchase a similar set in Copic markers, you would be spending anywhere from like 60 to 90 bucks. However, I want to mention that if you are thinking of using markers as a more long-term investment, meaning you've already tried them, you already know you like them, I would recommend recommend buying Copic markers simply because instead of purchasing the same marker again when it runs out, you can purchase an ink refill, which makes it more eco-friendly, and it means that you can purchase one marker and one ink refill and refill it multiple times. Whereas this one, if you were to run out of ink, you would have to purchase a new marker. And that brings me to my next point, and that is availability. These markers, I've never seen them in stores, so your availability is limited to online, which usually means you can get the better price, but if you run out of a marker in the middle of an illustration, you are limited to the shipping time in between you and getting your marker. Whereas Copic markers are available at most craft stores, and you can purchase them with a coupon, or you can buy them online for usually a great value. So you could purchase them in store, whereas these markers you can't. But if you're already looking at buying your markers online, I think the playing field is pretty level, considering that you can buy these at most of the same online stores. So it's really up to you and whatever it is that you want. All right, let's talk color range. There is no doubt that the Copic color range is freaking huge. There's like 356 colors. I think 72 colors is more than enough, and it really just means that you have to get a little bit more creative with how you mix and how you blend your colors. So I'm not saying that the color range difference is necessarily a bad thing, and sometimes if you're a beginner, it's kind of better to start out with a smaller color range, because then you have to get a little bit more creative on how you mix your colors, and it teaches you a lot. So I give the color range award to Copics, but I'm not saying that 72 is a bad thing. So that's my thoughts on that. Let's talk about the color coding system. This one was a freaking mess. I don't know what it's trying to tell me. I have no idea. And maybe that's just because I'm very heavily dependent on the Copic marker color system to figure out what a marker is and how it's going to blend with other markers. I'm very dependent on that, and I feel like I've become somewhat fluent in it over the years. So having a lack of a color coding system is disturbing, to say the least. So big win for Copic in that regard. Let's talk about shape. So I don't really have a preference here. I think they're both very comfortable to hold. They don't feel bulky, they don't feel heavy. They both don't roll off your desk, which is great. So I think the shape overall is a win for both. However, I think the only thing that I do prefer is the indication of which nib is on which end with Copic markers over Concept. So what would you call that? Like the nib indication category? Because as you can tell on the Copic markers, there's a thicker gray line here for the brush nib, and there's a lack of a gray line or a thinner gray line for the chisel nib. And so it's really easy just to pick up your marker and you automatically know which end is which, and it's just, you don't have to think about it. Whereas these ones, I kind of felt like I was having to pick it up and like look at it dead on and be like, okay, this is the fine tip nib. And that was a little bit time consuming. Plus, again, these smell so bad. Like I already have another headache from like just opening and closing these. It's crazy. So that is one thing, but I do want to kind of talk about the nibs in a slightly different way, and that is I sort of had an issue with how the brush nib was advertised on the Concept marker. Plus they call this like a 4-in-1 marker online in the product description, saying that you can get 4 different kinds of lines with these nibs, and I feel like you can get more than 4 different kinds of lines with any marker. So I feel like that was kind of a cheesy marketing tactic. Plus this is totally not a brush nib. Not by any means. This would not replace my Copic brush nib by any means. It is not as versatile. And so the Copic brush nib is a total win compared to this one. However, I do want to mention that I think I actually prefer the chisel nib on this marker to the Copic marker, just because it puts down an even layer of color a lot faster and easier than the Copic markers. I've mentioned before that I don't really think the Copic marker has the best chisel nibs. To me, they're kind of like dry and crusty unless they're like jam-packed full of ink. So the chisel nibs on the Copic markers aren't my favorite, but I let it slide because the brush nib does everything I need to and more. So with this one, the lack of a brush nib is also a big downside for me. So I think with nibs, I still have to give it to Copic marker, but I did just want to mention that I think that this one has a great chisel nib. If you are either a beginner or you're doing like drafting and design, concept markers are great, and I'm pretty sure that's what they were designed for, rather than like doing full sort of detailed illustrations. So with that in mind, these are great. But if you're using them in the same way that you would use Copics, I think that the Copic is the winner for that. So the remaining points that I'm going to cover is really going to be regarding the ink within the markers, rather than like the physical construction or the availability of the markers or anything like that. So the first thing I want to talk about is the ink feathering, and a quick note, this does depend a lot on the paper that you're using, because that is obviously, you know, when you buy a material, it's not just about that material, it's how you use it, what you're using it on, all of those things as well. And with the crescent render paper, it already kind of bleeds more than my standard marker paper, like the multimedia paper that I use or the Bristol board that I use, because it doesn't bleed a lot on those papers, but I do find on the crescent render paper, it does bleed quite a bit. I do like the crescent render paper, it's just be aware that it is one of those papers that bleeds a little bit more when you use markers. But even so, I felt like the concept markers bled and feathered a little bit more than the Copic markers. So as far as feathering goes, I think Copic is a win because it bleeds and feathers less. Let's talk about ink opacity. I think that the concept markers have a much more opaque ink, meaning that the ink comes out like much more full color right off the bat than the Copic markers. But again, this is one of those instances where it's like neither a good or a bad thing, because it really depends on what you're using it for. If you're wanting to kind of create gradients and blending, having an ink that's more similar to the Copic marker ink is great, because it can be buildable and you can sort of build and layer the colors a lot better. Whereas if you have a super opaque ink right away, it's going to be harder to layer and blend. And that was definitely an issue I ran into with the concept markers. So yes, the ink is more opaque, but it sort of depends on what you want out of your ink, whether that's a good or a bad thing. Now let's talk about smudging. Smudging was something that was really interesting because both of these markers performed exactly the same. They smudged with the same materials and then they didn't smudge with the same materials. So they're really even on that one, and they both performed really, really well. I was actually very impressed. Now I want to talk about layering, which is kind of something I alluded to with the ink opacity, and is something that I alluded to in the demo of the markers as well. So you probably already know my thoughts. I think that the Copic markers layer much better and much more effectively than the concept markers. Not that you can't layer with the concept markers, but it just sort of layers weird. If you layer the same color, it sort of bleeds weird and it's not really that even. And then if you layer different colors, it's even worse, which I'm gonna get into in just a minute when I talk about the big thing, and that's blending. But as far as layering goes, I think that the Copics layer way better than the concept markers. So that's a win for me with Copic. Now, ladies and gentlemen, drum roll, please. Let's talk about blending. So if you're like me and you're using alcohol-based markers to color your full illustrations, and you have a lot of detail, and you know you need to convey a lot of depth and dimension and texture, Copic markers are bar none the best marker that you can purchase. They are just, they do it all, you know, and they do it so well. And once you really get familiar with how they work, there is nothing that you can't do. The fact that they marketed the concept markers as being ideal for blending is a little bit troublesome for me, because I just did not find that to be the case. Maybe it's because I'm comparing them to such a high-end marker, but these just really didn't blend the way that I was anticipating, and I do have pretty high standards for blending, and these just didn't do it for me. You can get by with blending with these, it's just you run the risk of it being muddy, you run the risk of oversaturating your paper, you run the risk of it just kind of reacting weird with other colors, and to me that is just not something I want to deal with when I'm coloring with my markers. And again, what it comes down to is, if you are a longtime marker user, are you going to like these? Probably not, because you probably already have your standards set somewhere in the range of Copic markers or Winsor & Newton markers or Prismacolor. You probably already have pretty high standards for how your marker should perform. However, I will reiterate, if you are a beginner and you've never used markers, please don't shoot for the stars and get Copic markers right away. I can't emphasize that enough, because quite frankly, it's just, they're too damn expensive. But that's not to say that they're not well worth the price, because they are. But getting a marker like the concept marker is a good way to ensure that you are going to like working with expensive markers like Copics before you take the plunge and purchase them. So this is sort of your prerequisite marker to Copics. It's not a bad marker. I'm happy that I bought them. I'm never gonna open them again because they give me such a massive headache, but I think that they were good and it was kind of fun to experiment with them. I know I don't do a lot of art supply reviews here on my channel. I'm trying to change that and I'm trying to do more. That is it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really, really do appreciate it. Sorry it was so long, but I really do hope that you found this helpful. Again, links to all of the supplies are going to be in the description bar below, as well as links to all my social media. And also, if you're watching this on the day that I upload it, you should tune in later for my YouTube live stream. So that'll be happening around 4 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, and I hope to see you guys there. Thanks for watching so much. See you guys Friday.